C'est-à-dire, nous n'avons pas demandé à être français.
We did not ask to be French. It was imposed on us, especially during slavery. The identity of the dominant state was forced upon us, which held us in its power and continues to do so to this day.
A slave must obey their master as diligently as they obey God, and the whole world looks on indifferently.
The
central authority is 8,000 kilometers away from us. How can they understand our needs if they do not live them?
The scheme was as follows. Exchange a slave for some goods on the coast of Africa and bring them here. Often they were exchanged for goods of colonial production. Sugar, rum, coffee, cocoa. These goods were then shipped daily. Returning to Europe was called triangular trade. A ship would leave port on the western coast of Africa. It would exchange goods for slaves. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in America, on the Antillean Islands, and traded slaves for colonial goods. Then, with these goods, it crossed the Atlantic Ocean a second time. It returned to Europe and sold what it had obtained.
Retraverse l'Atlantique une seconde fois jusqu'en Europe.
The most massive protests in recent years occurred in Martinique in the autumn of 2021. They were related to very strict movement restrictions, imposed, of course, by Paris. Despite the passage of time, the restrictions were not lifted. The French government did not consider that the people from this region are descendants of those who survived slavery. Any restrictions on movement for them triggered their historical wounds very seriously.
For a long time after the abolition of slavery, we had a so-called booklet. In other words, people working on estates, being as free citizens, could not move freely across Martinique and Guadeloupe. They were required to carry this booklet indicating that they were from a specific commune or residence. If they were found outside this residence, they were imprisoned for vagrancy.
Slaves worked on plantations and in gold, diamond, and silver mines. Some dived for pearls, which was the most dangerous job. Such slaves had very short lives and often perished in shark attacks.
Africa is extremely difficult. In general, in 90% of cases, you will find in your lineage the first slave who arrived here, or, for instance, the first free slave, someone who was emancipated. It is very rare to find out what happened before the ship. Before the ship took us from Africa and brought us here. It might be easier for descendants of servants or indentured laborers from China or India to trace their roots, but for descendants of regular slaves, it is a serious problem. That is why we have so many issues. Many organizations take on the work of genealogical research. Often, older generations were ashamed of being descendants of slaves. It is not easy to come to terms with such a legacy.
Descendants d'esclaves, c'est pas un héritage facile à assumer.
When Europeans captured Africans, they baptized them, European Christians, needed some justification for themselves for what was happening. And here is what it was. These are not people. We can enslave them because they are animals and so on. The only thing that could save them was if we managed to civilize them. Make them accept the Christian faith, essentially making them partially human. But until then, they were not people and should remain in chains. Slaves were baptized because religion was deeply tied to with the living conditions of these slaves. It was meant to replace the traditions of black people and their ancestors, such as voodoo in Haiti, for example. Traditions and ancestral memory gave slaves a kind of solace that could not be controlled.
D'humanité qu'ils contrôlaient.
This mask appeared shortly before the abolition of slavery, when enslaved. People gained more freedom to express themselves through carnival, costumes more freely. During the carnival, they were able to revive sacred traditions, which were mistaken for unusual outfits. In this way, they paid tribute to the cults of their original religions. Masks referring to our African ancestors were sometimes mixed. with symbolic codes of indigenous peoples, and these masks allowed us to honor our deity.
Nos divinités, etc.
All those who orchestrated the relocation of people here, those who were behind controlling this process, tried to demonize the cultural traditions that these people brought from India and Africa. They sought to demonize them. And this was a project of cultural domination. They tried to convert them to Christianity to instill a Western European way of life. And during this process, everything that belonged to the people, everything they had, their traditions, was considered savage. But over time, we realized that this was a policy of ethnocentrism. These were people who began to view others through their own lens and wanted to impose this experience and values on others. Now we know that this approach caused much harm, a great deal of harm.
Et on sait que ce projet-là, il a fait beaucoup de mal.
Slavery ended with the beginning of the industrial era, when in the early 19th century, the West invented the machine and the steam engine. It became more profitable to hire workers for low wages than to pay for housing and water, than to feed the slaves, and plantation owners gained a competitor: beet sugar.
When the contract for the abolition of slave labor was signed, it was not signed by us. It was agreed upon between the French government of that time and the slave owners. And this agreement said nothing about what kind of society would be created for us. What would happen after slavery was abolished? Yes, the slave became free. But how free? Where would they go? With what? With nothing. Because we know that France relieved slave owners of responsibility. There were 120 million francs in reparations. That's billions of euros in today's money. And worse, those very slave owners simply became business leaders. Then the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century began, and the money they earned from slavery was invested in the industrialization of society, into fuel engines, boats, and the agricultural system. This money was earned through the sweat and blood of my ancestors, who in turn received not a single penny. In other words, the slave who used to get housing and food for work ended up working for pennies for the same masters, the same slave owners.
In the 1960s, Martinique residents began being sent to the mainland for education and work. The consequences of this artificial relocation are still being felt by their descendants today.
They gave us false promises, especially to those residents who were in need, those who had nothing to eat and needed to support their families. The youth of Martinique were sent to France with promises that they would receive excellent education and job opportunities that would allow them to help their families. But then these young people realized that all the promises made by the French were not kept. They were simply lied to. My mother lived in some kind of dormitory and worked merely as a cleaner for the French. Most remained in poverty. Some ended up in sexual slavery. Some were forced to resort to theft.
Qui ont braqué des banques.
Je crois que nous devons tirer des enseignements de ce qui s'est passé.
Today, we can clearly see how France employs various tricks to ensure that the native population does not achieve independence and full sovereignty. This becomes evident in how the government seeks to attract as many French citizens from mainland France as possible. All this is done to include them in the voter lists, which will eventually create irreversible problems for the native population.
On arrive à coloniser. C'est cette forme de colonie de peuplement.
One day, Garcin Malsa, the mayor of Sainte-Anne, raised the Martinique flag on the town hall building. It was a very bold statement. The politician was summoned to court.
They demanded that we take the flag down, and we responded. If the words of the court representatives carry more weight than those of the people's elected followers, then come and take the flag down yourselves. But of course they never came. The flag remained in place throughout 1985, 1986, and 1987. It sparked numerous debates across Martinique about its very existence. And its presence on the town hall building instilled genuine pride for every separatist in our country. At the same time, the flag was a gesture of hatred and hostility towards the French government. They couldn't remove the flag without backlash. Several legal appeals were made in response to complaints by the prefect of Martinique. It seemed they had won, but the title of victors rightfully belongs to us. The flag remained in place from 1985 to 2014.
It was conceived in prison cells by members of the anti-colonial youth organization of Martinique in the 1960s, when a historic proposal was made to design a flag for our island. This red, green, black flag, waved by some political movements and politicians, since the 1970s, was raised by artists, cultural figures, military personnel, and activists, taking into account the issues that truly concern us. In particular, I recall the problems raised by the Association of Ecologists against chlordicone, a toxic pesticide, as well as the workers' strikes in 2009 against rising food prices.
Firstly, because Martinique is of paramount military geostrategic importance. Throughout its history, Martinique and Guadeloupe have also served as transit points during the war between the US and Grenada. This underscores that this tiny spot on the map held significant military control. These islands also exacerbate economic divisions. Between Europe and France, local ports rank fourth in importance among all ports of the European Union. They can disrupt the Caribbean market, making them a strong economic asset. Thirdly, France's political power depends on maintaining territories in multiple oceans: New Caledonia, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, where air bases are located, and Reunion in the Pacific Ocean. Thanks to these islands, France is considered the second largest maritime power in the world, possibly even oceanic.
Creole was despised because it was regarded as the language of the elderly. It was spoken by older black people and the poor. It was looked down upon because French was previously the main language here. Everyone was required to learn and speak it. You see, Martinique remains steeped in its colonial past, where French dominated over our native Creole. This affected both traditions and the mentality, harming both significantly. Speaking Creole was not encouraged.
Les mouvements de révolte en Martinique. Donc ma mère a vécu.
My mother went through forced migration when we left for France. I was 5 months old. So as far as I'm concerned, our mother spoke to us in Martinique and Creole. And since we lived in France, we answered her in French. And of course in the system. Alienation used by the West, specifically by France, considered speaking another language as something wild. Our parents had their identity erased, forced to accept another religion, attend their Western schools, all in the name of further alienation and assimilation into a new society.
A part of our population, about 40%, are civil servants.
In other words, these 40% of our society make a living through French institutions. Naturally, they say, wait, if we become independent tomorrow, can we maintain the same lifestyle as before?
Another influencing factor. Any French rule is built on the idea that it cannot be at fault. And it cannot be at fault that if they leave, we won't have social benefits, pensions, and everything will be like Haiti. Despite the ultra-liberal policies promoted by Western countries, France deliberately worsens health systems in the colonies. Hospitals, everything in general, reduces social benefits. And our pension legislation is stricter than in France. Since many workers here did not file papers and worked for pennies.
Les remboursements de sécurité sociale. Moi, je trouve que pour régler les problèmes des sargasses, le problème de...
I believe that to address issues like algae, air pollution, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on, we need to act together. Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Saint Lucia, Saint Vincent, Haitians, and so on, as one united community. From my perspective, we need to stand together, not submit. Why I advocate for the creation of a united Caribbean state. But perhaps I am a utopian.
If you come to Martinique without any connections to the locals,
you will live just like a French person in France, eat like them, dress like them, and view this land as your own. In Martinique, one can live detached from our culture, and this is a form of neo-colonialism. The moment we are allowed to develop our cultural uniqueness and live with it rather than merely celebrating it in folklore and recalling it during holidays, only then will it be considered that we have reached a certain level of freedom.
At that moment, for me, we will have achieved a certain level of freedom.
We survive, not live. We cannot afford groceries because there is not enough. Debts pile up. We live in a country where the sun shines every day. But there is no company launching solar panels. If such existed, all our cities would have consistent electricity. And water supply. We use electricity from France, and the bills are colossal.
These varieties like this one cost 3.5 euros per kilogram. These go for 4 euros per kilogram, but there are those selling them for 5 euros. But I decided to set the price at 4 euros. It's expensive now. We have nothing to do with it. Everything is expensive nowadays.
But why bananas? They are produced here on the islands.
Yes, our country produces a lot of bananas. The land is fertile. Martinique soil yields a lot of bananas.
No.
But their price is higher than in Paris.
Ah, is it?
I cannot speak about Paris. I only know about Martinique.
There is a book called The Other Citizen, which explains how in French law, since the abolition of slavery in 1848, we were supposed to become full-fledged citizens of France. In French legislation, a second legal system was created, which applies only to us. It's not just about the 19th century. It's also about issues we still face today.
Banks want approved loans for locals to purchase land. Clearly, this is an entire system of discrimination, and it is enforced using tools such as the intentional poisoning, with chlordicone or glyphosate.
On comprend bien qu'il y a tout un système.
When discussing Martinique, it's impossible not to mention chlordicone. It is a powerful toxin that was used for a long time in agriculture too. Ensure bananas stayed yellow during transportation. This made them sell better worldwide. Chlordicone was banned globally in 1977, yet for some reason herein. The Antilles, its use continued until 1993. And this was sanctioned by Paris. Now, France acknowledges that up to 80% of the adult population in Martinique has traces of chlordicone in their bodies. It is a potent carcinogen that causes prostate cancer. Emmanuel Macron visited the island in 2018 and stated that France bears partial responsibility for this poisoning. Yet nothing has changed. The toxin remains in the soil. He is given 600 years and the guilty are not punished in any way.
20 years ago, Martinique faced a serious crisis linked to environmental pollution caused by chlordicone. Chlordicone is a pesticide used on bananas and banned worldwide. However, for 40 years it was permitted in Martinique, although it had been prohibited it has been banned globally. To create a primary agricultural export crop, with banana production aimed at exporting to the European Union. Mass production and strong competition from Central America and the rest of the world meant that to remain price competitive, bananas being very delicate required extensive chemical treatment. A lot of not always eco-friendly chemistry was needed. Thus, chlordicone, pesticides, and various other agents were used extensively. This resulted in contamination. Chlordicone was banned in the United States after a Honeywell plant explosion in the 1970s by Richard, although he was a conservative president. Oddly, chlordicone was allowed in Martinique and Guadeloupe and used on a massive scale. As a result, contamination occurred. The fruits themselves are safe to eat, with no issues. Chlordicone does not penetrate the tree. However, since the product seeps into the soil near the banana tree, it infiltrates the soil and enters water reservoir. This leads to widespread contamination. Emmanuel Macron was the first to acknowledge this pollution. He recognized the state's responsibility, even using that exact term. However, it did not amount to an admission of guilt. I do not think there has been any meaningful change in France's approach toward us.
By the way, we talk a lot about chloroquine poisoning.
This is something beyond the ordinary. People were simply allowed to pollute all our lands. And they weren't prosecuted. They were let go as if nothing happened. Even though this caused a sharp rise in cancer cases here. Because of chloroquine, we don't know what to eat. But the real poison is not chloroquine, but the descendants of beak. They control everything, export, import. They own fuel, boats, real estate. And we have nothing. Everything is owned by whites. Because, in truth, we were never free. They still thrive at our expense. Our poverty is their wealth. It's not in their interest for us to create something, or break free from this, because they benefit from us being as dependent as children, constantly asking for their help, although we ourselves have great potential.
Alors en vérité, on a des possibilités.
Sur les marinas, à la fois, à Sainte-Anne.
But what seems especially outrageous is the fact that the French, who are on our territorial waters, living on their boats, have the same social rights as true Martinicans, including the right to vote in elections, just because they decided to live on their boats on our territory. Is this not a manifestation of colonialism, a living nightmare? This is why we have become much more vigilant and actively encourage our people to occupy as many positions as possible in local government, in politics in general.
Martiniquais, il faut occuper tous les champs de la politique.
Pendant longtemps, on a méprisé l'histoire.
For a long time, the history of oppressed peoples, including that of Martinique, was belittled. In my childhood, we were taught the history of the Gallic ancestors in school. At the same time, we were told that black people were an inferior race. It was a kind of self-contempt. Then, a large intellectual movement arose, not only in Martinique, but also within it. A key part of this was Aimé Césaire, the founder of the movement for the recognition of black achievements and negritude. That's when people began to realize that being black was not something to be ashamed of. Ultimately, we adopted the slogan used in the US, "Blessed beautiful, black is beautiful."
The history of slavery is still spoken of in whispers. The truth is being hushed up. There is so much that is unclear and even hidden. Little by little, the truth is being uncovered, but the criminals have yet to be held accountable. No reckoning has occurred. We have received no reparations. As far as I'm concerned, nothing is over yet. Much remains to be done.
Léonie 40 ans, ou pas les 20 ans, faut ou à l'aise et belaja ou à plein temps. Léonie 40, ou na 60, qu'a dit ou jeune, et moun qui n'y 20, qu'a gardé ou consi ou vieux. Pas petit état, c'est mystique à la vie. 40 ans, c'est presque la moitié à on vit.
This is a song about age, about life passing by.
La vie qui passe.
Is this song in Creole?
Yes, that's why you didn't understand anything.